on time.
You wanted to know about B-17 pilot training. Well, largely it's a matter of putting across what we know about the airplane, what it'll do and what it shouldn't be asked to do. Maybe airplanes are like people. You don't really get to know them until after you've lived with them a while. Takes time, too, to get well acquainted with an airplane. Time to find out just how far you can go with her and still stay friends. That's important. And men like our instructor have lived with this airplane long enough to become pretty good friends with her. So his job is just a matter of giving you the benefit of his experience. The procedure is pretty well standardized, and you'll learn to be thankful for that. Routine, like this circle tour of the airplane at the start, for instance, makes the student's life a lot simpler. In the cockpit, you'll learn to follow the checklist because it helps you to keep your mind on your work. Detail's important when you're flying a big bomber, and using the checklist means you don't overlook a thing. After you get the plane off the ramp and down near the runway, you're ready for the run-up, one of the most important checks of all.
Center at an angle. That gets all your props safe over concrete for the run-up, and if there's a guy behind you, you won't blast him when you rev him up.
As your co-pilot, the instructor locks the tail wheel while she's rolling, so that when the wheel's in line, the lock pin will drop into place. Tail wheel locked. And brakes.
Brakes set.
Maybe here you'll switch to interphone. Easier to talk that way. Then the checklist again. And the instructor's command to check trim tabs. Set them at 0. Elevator trim tab. Rudder. Aileron. Then,
Before the run-up, always check your oil temperature. You ought to have at least 40 degrees before beginning the run-up.
Why not close cowl flaps? Hurry it up a little.
It might mean trouble. If you close them, you get uneven cooling, local hot spots, metal fatigue.
I get it. Just like bending a wire back and forth until it breaks.
That's it.
Exercise turbos?
Right.
you advance throttles to 1,500 RPM for turbo exercise. And you know why it's important. To get warm oil circulating through the turbo regulators. If regulator oil is stiff or congealed, the turbo wastegates won't react properly. One avoidable cause of a runaway turbo on takeoff. Leaving turbos on, you do a repeat on the props. Give them plenty of time to change pitch. Watch the tacks for that. If it's below freezing, exercise both turbos and props 4 times. Set the lock to keep the levers from creeping. And then, turbos off. And before the mag check, another important detail.
Before you rev them up, turn on your generators and check each one for ampere output. If they balance, they're all putting out all right.
Ampere output okay.
Now voltage and then turn them off.
$28.5 on each. Generators checked and off.
Check mags at 28 inches, starting with number 1.
While you're boosting manifold pressure, you remember there's a backfire hazard during the mag check. So you check turbos off, wastegates open, just to be sure.
Off. Left.
Don't watch the tank, watch the engine. Roughness doesn't always give you a quick drop in RPM.
Both. Right. Both.
Throttle up to the stop. A quick check of manifold pressure, and then full turbo. Since you're using 91 grade fuel here, you can't draw 46 inches. Power's cut about 10%. You set your lock. Check RPM, little below 2,500 on this fuel. Take a look at the engine, and everything okay. Act slowly on the throttle because of the induction backfire hazard. Same procedure on all engines. Act to command to call the tower for takeoff clearance, and you're off to the races.
Lock tail wheel. Parking brakes.
Hold it with your feet on the runway. Less hazard if you have to get away fast. Gyro. Set the gyro compass and check your compass heading against the heading of the runway.
Gyro set.
Generators.
Generators on.
Tailwheel locked. Light out. Now let's see your rider. 3-point takeoff.
3-point?
3-point. Hold the tail down, but don't give it enough pressure to cause a lot of wheel drag. And remember, you fly the airplane. I'll watch the engine.
The cow flaps open?
Right. Hold the brakes until you get 25 inches, then let her go. You'll have rudder control by the time you're hitting 50 miles an hour. With a crosswind, you might have to use the throttles a little. Rudder's enough today.
On 100 octane, you'd be using 46 inches and 2,500 RPM. Little less than that with this fuel. You'll leave the ground at around 100 miles an hour. Then a kick on the brakes to stop the wheel spin and gear up. Get rid of that drag fast. In takeoff emergencies, the bare belly is better than wheels. Check the light. Visual inspection later. 130 safe airspeed for power reduction. Manifold pressure first. Pilot's job, but today your instructor does it. Then RPM. You'll find it all in the tech orders and your checklist. Co-pilot trails cowl flaps, returning each valve to the locked position.
Check your landing gear.
Up left.
Up right.
And when your flight engineer gets an okay on the tail wheel, the switch is returned to neutral. Things happen fast on the takeoff, and it's easy enough to tense up a little. You did well enough, but...
Don't fight her. She won't throw you. On our next takeoff, you'll reduce power. I'll just make the final adjustments. Hold your airspeed to 135 on the climb. What's our power setting?
35 inches, 2,300.
Let's switch back to interphone again.
Do you always use this power setting for climbing?
Yes, with 91 grade fuel and up to 30,000 feet. If you're climbing on instruments, you should hold your airspeed at 160. Are you keeping her trim? Turbo and throttle settings always depend on altitude. For instance, if we'd taken off from a sea level field, we wouldn't need turbo or even full throttle for the early part of the climb. Another thing, always cut down manifold pressure before RPM. What's your altitude?
We're nearly 1,000 feet above the field. Fuel boost pumps off?
At 1,000 minimum. Check fuel pressure before and after. Gives you another check on engine fuel pump operation. Look at your manifold pressure. Manifold pressure will creep up steadily on the climb if you don't watch it. As free air pressure decreases on the climb, the pressure differential across the turbo buckets increases. Gives you higher turbo speed and more pressure from the blower.
What about carburetor air filters?
Turn them off at 8,000. Don't often hit dust above that. In emergencies, though, you can use them up to 15,000.
Dust that high?
No, not dust. Carburetor icing conditions.
So now they're ice filters.
In a way, yes.
Filters off.
Filters take air from inside the wing. In the kind of weather that ices up carburetors, air inside the wing is drier and warmer, than that you'd get from the ram air intake. Filter light's green, filter's off. Check your manifold pressure. Turning the filters off increases the manifold pressure about 1.5 inches. With carburetor icing conditions, of course, you'd use intercoolers hot, but you won't normally get carburetor icing above 12,000. And up there, you'll always want intercoolers cold. Thin air means higher rate of compression from the supercharger, and compression makes heat.
In the wrong places.
Nearly always in the wrong places.
You level off at 10,000 feet and cut her down to the proper setting for maximum long-range performance on 91 grade fuel. Manifold pressure down first to 28 inches. RPM next. You make this adjustment with one eye on the airspeed indicator because you use whatever RPM needed to get 150 miles per hour indicated. In this case, with your conditions, 1,600 RPM. Then fuel mixtures to auto lead. And your co-pilot closes cowl flaps since you have a safe margin in head temperatures.
What about the other power settings?
Well, you've used 3, modified for 91 grade fuel. Takeoff power, 5 minutes maximum continuous operation, climbing power, and maximum long range. They're all there on the panel. The power setting used in normal cruising is always figured from your flight conditions. Desired range, fuel available, weather conditions, altitude, gross weight, and perhaps 1 or 2 other things. In special cases, you'll always figure your best power setting from your flight computer. All settings are arrived at scientifically. Don't improvise. Plan the way they're written. And always keep an eye on your mixtures. In auto lean, don't use more than 29 inches with 91 grade and 2,000 RPM.
Explain something?
Try to.
That 3-point takeoff.
What about it? Didn't it feel right?
Well, maybe I didn't pull it right. I thought it was a little mushy. Isn't it better with the tail up?
Well,
And what about the stall hazard?
maybe we'd better figure it out on paper.
Well, here we are. An old friend you'll remember from flying school days. She knows her way around. Call her Tail Up Myrtle. Now, take it easy, Myrtle. When Myrtle's parked on the ground, she's sure enough in a stalling or near stalling attitude. So on the takeoff, you lift the tail both to decrease drag and get a safe margin below the stall angle. And she takes off like a nice baby, and there's no arguing about it. But with the missus here, it's different. In the 3-point position, she's already in a flying attitude. On the takeoff run, the relative wind's parallel to the ground. So say the ground makes one leg of your angle of attack. Chord line makes the other leg. Angle of attack in 3-point attitude, about 10 degrees. But with power on, the stalling angle for this airplane's about 19 degrees. So when you hold the tail down on the takeoff, you have a nice, cozy margin of 9 degrees below the stall angle. And when you leave the ground, the path of the relative wind changes, so that the angle of attack actually decreases. You get maybe another 4 degrees of safety, and you haven't a care in the world. Now let's dig a little deeper. Think of the forces at work when you take off as a team of little guys who are in there working for or against you all the time. For instance, gross weight of the airplane. On the ground, he bears down hard on the landing gear. When we're ready to start the takeoff run, you'll meet a pal of his. Wheel drag. The harder gross weight bears down on the wheels, the bigger and stronger wheel drag gets. That's definitely not good, especially if your runway's soft or slushy. Think of lift as a kind of muscle man working from the wing, pulling up gross weight. Speed makes him pull harder. An increase in the angle of attack also makes him pull harder. Get the relationship between lift, weight on wheels, and wheel drag. The more lift, the less weight on wheels. Less weight on wheels, smaller wheel drag. Then, of course, there's thrust. He's your power.
And aerodynamic drag. He's with you all the time, except when you're parked on the ground. Now, let's try to visualize what happens on a two-point takeoff. At the start of the run, lift increases steadily. Lift takes more and more weight off the wheels. Taking weight off the wheels steadily reduces wheel drag. Then, just when things are looking good, you lift the tail. Angle of attack decreases. That cuts down lift. Lift lets weight go back down on the wheels, and wheel drag increases again. Aerodynamic drag is cut a little, but not enough to compensate for the extra wheel drag. Speed still won't build up as fast as it would with the tail down. Even on a smooth runway, you'll need more room and maybe 20 or 30 miles an hour more speed to get off than if you'd kept your tail down. If the runway's messed up with mud or slush or water, maybe you won't get off at all in the space you have. But keep the tail down. Take advantage of the three-point angle of attack, and lift goes to work on gross weight right away. Wheel drag gets smaller and smaller. You'll be airborne at maybe 100 miles an hour, and without using up all your runway. And that's something to remember when you're lined up on a nice homemade strip in the jungle, with mud underneath you and trees dead ahead.
Well, how do you like her? Try a little problem when you get over the field. Say you're coming in after a long mission, you're a little short on gas, and when you arrive, the field's closed in.
Beeline for an alternate base.
No, Sal, you're the hell and gone from nowhere. You're lucky to have one base to come home to.
Cut the end boards and hang around until she opens up.
Well, you're to hover all right, but don't cut the end boards. She'll burn more coal on 2 than she will on 4 on long-range settings. Think it over. All right, here we are. Granite stuff straightest below, up to, say, 2,000. Don't know when we'll be able to find a hole in it. Instrument letdowns out. What are you going to do? Don't you like it up here?
Like it better down a bit if I'm low on fuel. Need less power and less fuel for a given indicated airspeed. Air's not so thin. Crops take fewer horses.
Okay, that's part of it.
When you get down to 8,000, you give the command for carburetor filters on, and you finally level off at around 500 feet above your theoretical overcast.
When you level off above the overcast, the idea is to keep from going places. Now, that's simple. Cut your speed down to 120, even if you have to reduce your RPMs to 1250 to get it. Try it first with 1,400 RPM. All right, reduce manifold pressure. Try with 26 inches.
Get us in the Bombardier?
Now, your weight's all right. You've used up most of your gas on the way home, and I hope you didn't bring any bombs back. Cut your RPM down a little more. 1250 is the minimum. With this hovering maneuver, fuel consumption's cut down to about 95 gallons an hour. At the end of a mission, you'll have a light load, so it's absolutely safe. Keep your banks at a 10-degree angle, and just sit it out.
Regular helicopter.
Time to go in, then. Landing instructions from the tower, weather, altimeter setting, and back to work again.
When you're ready for a landing, be sure your co-pilot runs through the checklist. No matter how good you are, flying means fatigue, and fatigue does things to your memory. So if you want to bring in this property without an insurance claim, have everything checked in order. Altimeter, okay. Crew positions. Automatic pilot, off.
Crew members at their proper stations. Side guns stowed. All turret guns up and pointing rear.
Booster pumps on. Your power plant should be ready for full takeoff power in case a go-round is necessary. Mixtures auto-rich, intercoolers cold, carburetor filters on, wing de-icers off. That's important. Wing de-icer operation changes the stalling characteristics of the airplane. Holden Tower, this is 641 on downwind leg, over.
641 on downwind leg, cleared to land, wheels down, over.
Roger.
Landing gear down. Down left.
Down right. Tail wheel down, trailing antenna in. Check brake and hydraulic pressure.
Brakes okay. Pressure around 750.
RPM 2100. Turbos set. Now we have power immediately available for a go-round if we need it. Flaps should be lowered on the downwind leg, but not until airspeed's below 147. 1/3 flaps on the downwing leg, full flaps on final approach. And if you have to go around, you don't need to milk up your flaps. They'll come up slowly enough.
You hold airspeed at 130 indicated on the base leg of the pattern. Then, in a matter of seconds, you make your bank into the final approach.
Full flap. High RPM.
120. 115. Don't close your throttles until you're sure of a landing. 112. 110. Freezer on. Hydraulic pressure's okay. Otherwise, you'd gunner and take off again. Hull flaps open and locked. Turbos off. Booster pumps off. Wing flaps up. Get them up sooner if you have a muddy runway. Tail wheel unlocked. Generators.
Generators off.
Cutting the inboard engines is the co-pilot's duty normally. The pilot should keep his mind on his taxiing. But it's quiet on the hangar apron today, and the instructor asks you to do it. Good thing, too, since you weren't too sharp about it.
You can cut your inboards now. Check turbos off first. You need engine oil pressure to open the wastegates. No. Rev them up to 1,000 before you cut them.
parking brakes?
No, hold it until the chocks are in. If you set your brakes on hot drums, you'll bake the expander tubes. Don't turn off the ignition until the engines have stopped turning over. Walden Tower, this is 641. Mission complete. See that all other switches are off before turning off the batteries and the main line.
Booster pumps off. Landing gear, wing flaps, neutral. De-icer, anti-icer off. Inverters?
Inverters off only when the instruments have returned to neutral.
Inverters off. Batteries off. Main line off.
Lock control surfaces. That's that. Except for the bookwork. Just give them the facts. One more thing. Record the time of day and number of minutes of oil dilution if you were diluting in this. Well, how do you feel?
Okay, I feel great.
Remember, it's just another airplane. It's a little bigger than most. But the fact that you're flying her means that you've moved into the big time. And the payoff is it's the safest crate you ever flew.
That's part of it. Not all of it by a long shot, but part of it at least. It's a little more complicated than a buckboard wagon. Still, on the other hand, it's not quite as elaborate as a battleship. Make things as easy for yourself as you can by taking advantage of little devices like the flight computer and the load adjuster and the checklist. All the rest, and that's plenty, is up to you. But I guess by this time you understand that pretty well.
This picture concerns emergency procedures in the B-17. What's your reaction?
A guy's got a lot of responsibilities with a big plane like that. A lot of things to think about, even when everything's okay. Nothing had better go wrong.
Fly until the wings fall off, I always say. Of course, that makes me a hot pilot, but so what? You can't fly an airplane straight and level all the time.
Emergencies? What you do about them sort of depends, doesn't it?
Sounds logical. Go on.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different things can go wrong. Depends on what the trouble is and what the circumstances are. Sometimes there's only one thing you can do.
Sure, hit the sill. Boom, back to the solid stuff. But that's only if the plane can't be flown and can't be landed. You can land her when you can't fly her sometimes, and without a landing field, too.
Sure. Slide her in, place her belly gently on the ground, and slide for home. A little hard on the props.
And the ball turret.
Yeah, but plenty of guys have walked away from those, and a lot of times the plane's a long way from being a total loss. Does that answer your question?
Well, in a way. But for movie purposes, can't you think of some emergencies with happy endings?
Oh, sure. You don't always wind up on the ground. Keep 'em flying. Well, say, for instance, you're cruising along smooth as silk. Everything seems to be fine. putting a big fat OK in your performance log. You're wondering if maybe the bombardier will give you one of his 23 sandwiches. When suddenly your co-pilot whips around and yells at you, "Fire in number 4 engine." And in a few seconds, you've done about all you can do, except hope and maybe pray a little. Speed is the thing.
Good point, Captain Scott. Can you slow it down enough to explain the reasons for some of the things you did?
Well, sure, I guess so. Fire has to be fed by something, I figure. In an engine, that'd be gas and oil. They're the number one enemy, so I take care of them first. By shutting off the gas. Fuel shut-off valve closed, booster pump off. Then I feather it. So if an oil line's opened up, oil won't be squirting around in there, feeding the fire. During all this, I make plenty sure I'm shutting down the engine that's on fire and not some other engine.
How about opening that throttle before you feather to get rid of the fuel ahead of the shut-off valve?
Could be done, but it means waiting 5 or 6 seconds to start feathering. And if it's oil instead of gas that's burning, you just wasted time. Anyhow, unless you're in a descent, you're ordinarily drawing enough power for the carburetor to help meter out that gas during the feathering.
You can usually tell whether it's a gas or an oil fire by the smoke.
Sure, Anderson. Oil smoke is usually sort of gray, and smoke from gas is generally black. But personally, I won't be taking time to examine it, even if I can see it that clearly. I'd rather shut everything off that might be feeding that fire and ask questions afterwards. My co-pilot increases airspeed to try to blow the fire out, diving the plane, or if altitude is low, increasing power on the 3 good engine. Meanwhile, I get the cowl flaps open on the engine that's on fire to help cool things off in there. Then, lock the cowl flaps so if the hydraulic line's broken, the fluid won't keep feeding the fire. The only other urgent business left then is to look for some level geography and hope that you don't have to use it or the alarm bell. Of course, somebody's got to keep the airplane flying. The guy on your right or you. You got to keep up that wing that's lost the power and see that airspeed stays within the recommended limit. It's no good putting out an engine fire if you lose an airplane doing it. Chances are the fire will go out if you use what you know and work fast so it doesn't get too much head start on you. Then you can get your airplane trimmed when everything's under control and clean her up. Get the ignition off on the feathered engine, close those open cowl flaps to reduce drag when you're sure the engine fire's out and things are cool enough, and fly her back to base on 3.
Captain Scott, the next engine fire I have, I hope you're there.
Thanks. Want my autograph?
I guess not. All those X's look alike to me.
Okay. What about these emergencies? You got any ideas about them?
Why, sure.
The floor is yours, Captain Sellers.
Thanks. Well, let's see. Scott here goes in for obvious things like engine fires. I guess maybe I'll talk about an emergency situation you don't see right off.
Subtle stuff.
Well, maybe. Say you've got a B-17 that's apparently okay. Her engines and controls are in perfect mechanical condition. Now, she should be as stable as a pool table, but she's not. She flies like a stove. Every time the pilot gets her nicely trimmed, she starts doing over the waves. She's unstable. He's fighting the control column all the time, correcting her attitude. Now, what's wrong? Her tail end's loaded down with some equipment or souvenirs or something like that, and her CG is too far aft. When he gets her home, he's got some sore muscles to remind him that a B-17 is safest and easiest to fly when you haven't messed up her original design. Now look how she's figured out. All the weight in her balances up, as though you've taken the pounds out of her structures, parts, fuel, and the tons out of her nacelles, lumped them all together and put them in a particular spot. That's practically what her designers did. They juggled her weights until center of gravity was near the forward end of the plane, a good long distance from the stabilizer. That distance was a substitute for size in the stabilizers and elevators. Making them large would have given them power to control the attitude of the wing, but would also have increased drag and weight. So they were given the needed power another way, by keeping the area fairly small and by placing the airplane center of gravity well forward. And that gives them a lot of leverage to work with. With the airflow around her, center of gravity becomes a sort of pivot point. The airplane flies just as though she were suspended from a rod across her wings. Trim your airplane for level flight and she'll hold her own. When a gust hits that wing, causing it to rise, pushing her nose up, the stabilizer's angle of attack increases. They grab a little more airflow, and that small added force multiplied by all that leverage is enough to overpower the wing with all its added force. The airplane restores to trimmed attitude and trim speed. She's got longitudinal stability. Okay, but if Joe Dokes discovers a lot of room in her tail where he can put stuff and loads her up, she's like a different airplane. Look what's happened to her center of gravity. It's moved back. It wasn't riveted down, it's a point of balance. Move the weight and you move it. That pivot point moving back has shortened that lever arm, and the elevators and stabilizers have lost a lot of their leverage that they had before, a lot of their power. Now when a gust hits her wing, developing more forces up there, that tail is helpless. The wing takes off in a new direction and keeps on going. What's the cure? That's right. Move the weight out of the tail. Get the center of gravity farther forward. Give the leverage back to the stabilizers and elevators. Now she's okay again. CG still isn't where it was originally, but it's close enough. There's some leeway. The mean aerodynamic chord measures 177.5 inches. And if CG is anywhere from 32 to 19% of the chord length, back from the leading edge of the wing, elevators and stabilizers have the leverage that they need. Now that gives you about 2 feet of range. Use the load adjuster that comes with your airplane. Calculate your CG, stay within that range, and you'll have a stable airplane to fly. One that's less tiring on long missions, more accurate for bombing, and safer on instruments.
Nice lecture, Doctor.
Thanks.
Just one loophole. That business about the airplane being loaded so far aft it's clear out of control. It's pretty extreme.
Well, it isn't impossible, is it?
No, but you can fly them when CG is after 32 quite a bit, even after 35 with a downspring. It's hard work, yeah, but it still isn't what you'd call an emergency.
It could be.
Well,
Look, say you've got an airplane that's unstable because of rearward CG. You're in the overcast and you're on instruments. You're busy with something else besides the controls, and so's your co-pilot. Maybe you don't realize how unstable your plane is. You could wind up in one of those spots that pilots have bad dreams about.
Don't take any chances stalling the B-17. Stalls are too dangerous in such a big plane. Control forces might overpower the pilot.
But that nightmare belongs to pilots who've never stalled the airplane. Not that they should rush right out and try it. That's prohibited. A stall is no picnic. But it's not ordinarily a serious emergency either.
Unless the pilot reacts too slowly or does the wrong thing. I was thinking of a pilot who stalls his plane inadvertently. If he knows what goes on, sure, he'll be okay. If not, it might be bad, that's all.
Captain Sellers, this is a training film. What about stalls?
In general...
No. Don't take any chances stalling the B-17. Stalls are too dangerous in such a big plane. Control forces might overpower the pilot.
But that nightmare belongs to pilots who've never stalled the airplane. Not that they should rush right out and try it. That's prohibited. A stall is no picnic. But it's not ordinarily a serious emergency either.
Unless the pilot reacts too slowly or does the wrong thing. I was thinking of a pilot who stalls his plane inadvertently. If he knows what goes on, sure, he'll be okay. If not, it might be bad, that's all.
Captain Sellers, this is a training film. What about stalls?
In general, well, the stalling characteristics of a Ford are quite a source of comfort. Power-on stalls are more violent. Power-on accelerated stalls are dynamite, just as in any plane. And most stalls aren't that kind.
That's my boy there who's talking.
Go on, you're doing fine. What happens?
Well, let's see. The B-17 goes into a stall. The stall begins at the root of the wing, spreading out toward the tip, so that the wingtips cease flying last. That's good. Completely stalled head-on, she drops without much tendency to fall off on one wing. Ease her nose down and you're flying again. The danger of spinning out is slight because of that dorsal fin. It's one of the biggest vertical stabilizers in the business, and it gives the airplane directional stability. So her tendency, instead of spinning out of a stall, is to hold the direction in which she originally stalled. That's good, too. When you stall on a turn, of course, you've got a low wing to think about. Use the rudder to lift it. Never use aileron to recover from a stall. It'll only make things worse. And your control reaction should be immediate, but moderate, never violent. You don't need to dive her. Ease her down as soon as you get the stall warning. Warning usually comes about 5 miles an hour ahead of the stalling speed of the airplane. The tail buffets, and you know something's about to happen, and you usually have plenty of time to recover during that warning period. Don't slam her nose down. Just bring it down easily to the horizon, and you've got full control again. She won't even settle much. Go into action when you get that stall warning. Chances are you won't ever get into a really violent stall. In any case, if your plane's loaded right, you'll have both longitudinal and directional stability to help you keep out of trouble. Those two and a combination of a good working knowledge of your plane is all you need.
Sellers, where'd you get all that book learning?
Book learning?
One kind of a stall you overlooked. A lot of guys were afraid of it.
What's that?
Stall when you retract wing flaps. Like on a go-around, where you're pretty close to the ground and can't afford to lose altitude.
Well, what about it?
Sure, Anderson, you give out for a change.
How much to it? You won't stall when you spill your flaps if you're above flaps-up stalling speed of your plane.
Reassuring, Captain. Care to go into the reasons why?
Well, it's really pretty simple. I'm not much on studying. Books, I mean. Like Sellers.
Say, listen.
So I asked a guy about it one time when I had the chance. He's one of those aerodynamicists who works in the wind tunnel. Pretty smart Joe. The way he explained it,
Here's the wing of your airplane. Its angle is always the same in relation to the airplane. The angle at which it attacks the airflow is subject to change. Change the angle of attack, you vary the amount of lift developed by the wing. Steeper angle, greater lift. Of course, you do that by changing the attitude of your airplane. But there's another way you can get about the same effect. Lower your wing flaps. It's just as though you'd increase the wing's angle of attack by nosing the airplane up. All right, your flying flaps down, your airplane speed and attitude are adjusted to that condition. Then you retract those flaps. What happens? You lose some of the lift. Trim of the plane changes. There's less downwash on the tail. It rises. The airplane noses down a little and picks up speed. Quite a bit of speed, in fact, because you've also lost flap drag. Now, that's all satisfactory, except that loss in altitude. If you don't want that, you'll have to do something else. Flaps down again. Now, this time, as they come up, pull the nose of your airplane up. So the wing's actual angle of attack will be the same when flaps are up as it was for all practical purposes when flaps are down. Now, have you lost anything?
Not altitude, certainly. By pulling the nose up, you kept the lifting power of the wing constant. And you've gained some speed because you've lost the drag of those flaps. Just watch your airspeed.
As long as the airspeed is above stalling speed of the plane with the flaps up, you can spill them, pull her nose up to hold altitude without fear of stalling her. Okay?
Useful information. How do you apply it?
Like I said, when you have to make a go-around or almost any time you want to spill flaps and keep altitude. Like in the short-distance takeoff I did one time with a student.
An emergency takeoff? Let's hear about it.
You're stuck for an explanation now, Andy.
Ordinarily, there's nothing to it, really.
How do you do it?
Okay. You use 1/3 wing flaps, 15 degrees to increase lift of the wing. That takes weight off the wheels, cuts down wheel drag faster, so you get up more speed and get off sooner. Also, you run your engines up to full military power before releasing the brakes. Get more speed from the start. It's a good trick if you've got a runway that's apt to slow you down a bit. Slush, mud, turf, or if you've got a runway that's a little shorter than it should be. This one time, the runway was a little short, with an obstacle at the end of it, and not the kind you'd pick if you had a choice. The student with me didn't like it any better than I did. But he doesn't scare easy. He sizes up the situation and goes to work. When everything's set, he orders 1/3 flaps. And we get the flaps set. Then he pours the coal to her, building up to full military power. Brakes off, and we're on our way. I don't have to coach you much. Keep that tail down. Need all the lift we can get from that wing. Not too much or you will add wheel drag. That's it. Gear comes up as soon as possible. Co-pilot checks engine operation and number 4 looks bad. We're losing it. Let the kid know about it. Get set to take it away from him. Losing number 4 engine. Get that wing up now. Right engine dead. Left rudder, left aileron. Flying the airplane's always first. Good. Keep right wing a little high. More speed will give us more control, though. Spend a little altitude, buy some speed. We can climb if we have to. Ought to get his flaps up before he feathers, if he has any power at all in the bad engine, especially if the airplane's heavy. Airspeed's okay for it. Flaps up. The kid gives the command. Nose her up a little, son. Still work to do. She's losing oil pressure. And the kid comes right back. Feather number 4. Feathering button first. Turbo and throttle. Then mixture and the cowl flaps. Heard about a joker once who feathered the wrong one. Better not feather at all than hit the wrong button. Got speed now. We can start climbing. Reduce power. 38 inches. RPM 2300. Always should have at least 100 feet of altitude. And airspeed of 135 before reducing power and starting the climb. Trim her up and we'll take her to home base. Long as we're out of the woods, we can clean her all up. Would have cut fuel first if it had looked like a fire hazard. Fly the airplane. That comes first, last, and always.
Rest of it's pretty much normal procedure, bringing her back. We don't use flaps until we're darn sure of being able to come on in. 1/3 on the base leg, full flaps on final approach.
She'll float a little coming in with one feather. Allow for it.
Tabs are neutral now. The kid's keeping that right wing up. Keep it well up until you're on the final approach and reducing power. I guess the kid'll do.
But if you think we actually spent that much time doing it, you're nuts.
Anderson, how'd you ever set that plane down on that short runway?
I didn't. Brought her home where there's plenty of landing room.
But you took off from that short runway. You must have had to land on it sometime.
Well, oh, no. You don't get me to talk about a short-distance landing, too.
Oh, come on.
Not me, brother. I'm all talked out.
Captain Scott, it was your idea.
Okay, but Anderson should have done it for you. It's just the reverse of the short-distance takeoff. On the approach, you bring her in slow and set her down as near the end of the runway as possible. If you don't have much to begin with, you don't want to waste any. Land her 3 points. Now start your flaps coming up and get your tail up as soon as you touch. That reduces lift and gets a lot of weight down on the main landing gear where the brakes are. Ordinarily, that much brake pressure, it means skidding. But with so much extra weight on the wheels, it all goes into drag. Drag's what you want to keep your landing distance down. You can ground loop her, too, if you have to. About those brakes now. They're dual jobs with 2 expander tubes instead of 1. And there's not the danger of brake failure there used to be. But these double brakes really take a hold. Don't ride them any harder than you really have to. On this short distance landing especially. You really climb on and bear down, you can lose a tire. And having one of your wheels disintegrate isn't going to help you stay on the runway. Play it on the safe side when you're braking those wheels for a short distance landing or in any emergency. Use what you know. Figure your percentages and bet where the odds are smallest against you. This stuff isn't cut and dried. Some guy figures something out, tries it, and if it seems to work, passes it on to the next guy.
Who's done some figuring for himself and probably knows a better way.
Sure. Anderson here doesn't speak many English, but what he means is keep your mind open. Work at it all the time. Nobody has the last word in stuff like this.
That's right. Not even in a movie.
When I was going through B-17 transition training, I was the guy they got to calling Induction Joe. You know how stuff like that gets started. Little things to begin with that had nothing to do with the induction system. Like the time we were going through the control check and I got a little fouled up with the earphones. Well, guys like a laugh now and then, and you're always willing to cooperate. Take little things like that in your stride, and pretty soon they're forgotten. Then comes a day when something serious happens and you begin to worry. Hard luck Charlie, Induction Joe. Maybe there's something to it. Induction Joe, that was because 9 times out of 10 it was something in the induction system that got me into trouble. Runaway turbo on takeoff, for instance, although that day I did all right. But take that time we were out in a bit of weather. On that occasion, I was just plain ignorant. Our trouble was a little touch of carburetor icing. I started out well enough. Intercooler's hot. Something else now. Let me see, what was that? Oh, yeah. Air filter's on. But I was still short a trick or two, and I knew it. My co-pilot was an old-timer, good instructor, and I picked up a lot from him. Things like this I never forgot. But all this Induction Joe stuff was beginning to get on my nerves. I think it was the day after that flight that I decided I'd better do something about it. Got hold of a copy of the tech order and started boning up on some of that theory stuff. Induction Joe, huh? Okay. I'll make myself a bona fide, Simon Pure, platinum-plated expert on the induction system. Of course, I'd never been much of a guy for book work, but with this, I stuck it out until I could actually see the whole business work. Carburetor fillers, turbo, intercooler, combustion chamber, all of it. Although I know a lot of ships nowadays have the electronic turbo control, I sort of stayed with the hydraulic regulator system. That's what we had on my airplane then, and it's on the one I'm flying now. If you have it whipped, the electronic system's pie. It may sound a little corny, but I got to thinking of the whole thing as a B-17's breathing apparatus. So in talking about it, I guess it's a good idea to begin with the nose. So start up here at the leading edge of the wing where the ram air intake's located. That's the nose, at least when you're not using the carburetor air filter. The filter itself, a kind of secondary or substitute nose, is tucked up inside the wing. Position of this valve determines which nose your engine's breathing through. Right now, the toggle switch up in the cockpit is set in the filter's off position, and the valve here blocks off the filter passage. When you flip the toggle for filters on, the door to the ram air intake's shut, and the passage from the filter is open. Normally, use filters always on the ground and up to 8,000 feet. Keep them on above that if dust conditions warrant it, although they shouldn't be used above 15,000. Turbo boost is supplied by the impeller fan. This compressor sucks in air from the outside and forces it ahead to the engine, which at high power settings needs plenty of oxygen. The impeller's powered by an exhaust turbine, which we'll take a look at later. Its speed, of course, is variable. High impeller speed means more compressing power. The more boost you give her in the cockpit, the more speed and compression you'll get down here. But when you compress air, you raise its temperature. The compressed air left of the impeller is hotter than the uncompressed air above it. This heat must be reduced before the air reaches the engine, and that's what the intercooler's for. Little refrigerator job, this intercooler. Cool air from the outside passes over the pipes, cools the hot air going through the pipes. Cold air intake is up here in the leading edge of the wing. The valve's set now for intercooler cold, way you want it except in emergencies. Intercooler hot, valve blocks the intake. But in normal operations, always use intercoolers cold. For except in special emergencies, intake air temperature must be reduced to a safe value for the combustion chamber. Carburetor's the next stop on this cook's tour. And here it is, greatly simplified. Venturi throat at the top. Throttle valve below it. And beneath it, the fuel jet. Watch that jet as we move mixtures from auto-rich to auto-lean. Less fuel, same amount of air. Back to auto-rich. More fuel, air still constant. Now, without changing mixture controls, let's throttle a little and watch that fuel jet. The amount of fuel decreases as the amount of air is cut down by the throttle. Whenever you use the throttles, the carburetor automatically keeps the mixture ratio constant. Watch it when we open the throttle. More air, more fuel, whatever the mixture setting. Engine power, of course, depends upon the amount of fuel burned. But the amount of fuel that can be burned efficiently depends upon the amount of air admitted by the throttle. Hence, more air, figured in pounds, means more power, more thrust, more speed in level flight, or faster rate of climb. Now the engine blower. This impeller is powered by the engine itself. Shares with the turbo supercharger the work of delivering air to the combustion chamber. Speed, or compressing power, varies directly with engine RPM. The manifold delivers air to the cylinder. The barometric reading that registers on your manifold pressure gauge is taken here, between the engine blower and the combustion chamber. At sea level, you can draw 38 inches manifold pressure with the engine blower alone. No turbo boost needed. Turbo supplies the other 8 inches needed for takeoff power. Full throttle, full turbo, 2,500 RPM. Now, let's move on to the combustion chamber, the source of power itself. Intake valve, top right. Exhaust valve, top left. Intake. Compression. Ignition. Exhaust. Intake. Compression. Ignition. Exhaust. Remember, power varies directly with the number of pounds of fuel-air mixture forced into the combustion chamber. That explains the importance of engine blower and turbo. The exhaust gases aren't wasted. They're used, as you know, to power the turbo supercharger here near the end of the stack. We've met the impeller or fan before. Stopped there early in the trip. The bottom wheel here is the turbine, similar in principle to a water turbine, with exhaust gas substituted for water. The turbo controls in the cockpit work through the turbo regulator to change the position of the wastegate at the end of the exhaust stack. In its present position, the wastegate is full open, meaning very low turbine speed, no turbo boost. When the wastegate is closed, it forms an obstruction at the end of the exhaust stack, and the exhaust, thus bottled up, must take the only other way out through the turbine nozzles across the turbine buckets, greatly increasing the speed of the turbo. When the wastegate is closed, or partly closed, the exhaust back pressure is greater than the outside air pressure below the turbine nozzles. It's this difference in pressure, or pressure differential, which actually powers the turbine and causes changes in its speed. Closed wastegate, high differential, high speed. Open wastegate, low differential, low turbo speed. The wastegate position perhaps has the greatest effect on turbo speed, but there's another influence also operating, engine RPM. Engine RPM, which you set with your prop pitch controls, determines the speed of the pistons. And, of course, when you increase piston speed, the rate of flow of exhaust gases increases. Obviously, this must affect the speed of the turbo, which is driven by exhaust gases. Let's look at it. Say that now you're turning a low engine RPM. Now, without changing the position of the wastegate, you increase engine RPM. Rate of exhaust flow is increased, and higher turbo speed results. That's worth remembering for a reason we'll see later. Now for the turbo regulator. Turbo adjustments in the cockpit are communicated mechanically to the regulator, which responds by changing the position of the wastegate. This hydraulic regulator does its work by means of engine oil pressure, carried to the regulator by a pressure line and a return line. Loss of oil pressure, naturally, means loss of control over the wastegate. The exhaust balance line provides the regulator with a means of automatic control over the wastegate. This line carries exhaust back pressure to the regulator. Any change in exhaust back pressure here in the stack is communicated directly to the regulator, and the regulator readjusts the position of the wastegate to restore exhaust back pressure to its original value. Remember that your turbo setting in the cockpit is simply a command to the regulator to maintain a constant gas back pressure in the exhaust stack. Manifold pressure may fluctuate at any one setting, but exhaust back pressure will stay constant. Well, that's the way I got to seeing these things after I'd boned away at them a while. If I'd been up on this business right from the start, I'd never have pulled the boner I did once during the mag check. I was doing all right up till then, too. Manifold pressure to 28 inches and boom, left. Yeah, something wrong, all right. Turbo's on during the mag check. That's a bad deal, and I was old enough to know better. But I went on with the mag check, hoping I hadn't wrecked anything. And of course, it was all right when I ran it up to full throttle. But I was way short on turbo boost. The flight was off that day. It was back to the hangar for us, a good burning out from my instructor. Here's what he pounded into my head. Turbos on during the mag check means wastegates closed during the mag check. And, brother, if there's any possibility of an exhaust backfire, the closed wastegate situation is just about as sensible as this one. I'm afraid I was just about that smart. For closing up the stack with the wastegate during the mag check is every bit as dumb. If you get a backfire, your exhaust stack will make like a cannon. And you're all set for a beautiful backfire during the mag check if only one of your 18 spark plugs in one engine is fouled, as the right one is here. The left plug is carrying the whole burden of ignition in this cylinder. Fouling of plugs, of course, is most likely to occur in the lower cylinders. Now, with the right plug fouled, you're obviously getting combustion in that cylinder on both. And when you switch to left, the situation's unchanged. Remember now, the other 8 cylinders are okay. They're sending hot exhaust charges out into the exhaust stack, heating the stack, making it one long spark plug. So what happens when you switch to right, which means sending an unburned charge out into that stack? The unburned charge is ignited by the heat of the stack and the hot exhaust from the other cylinder. If the wastegate had been open, the backfire could have passed harmlessly out at the end of the stack. Even if all your plugs are clean, you still have a backfire hazard during the mag check. The danger then lies in accidentally switching to off. If that happens, all 9 cylinders will fail to ignite. 9 unburned charges will pass into that hot exhaust stack. I used to have nightmares like that after I got so I really understood this stuff. Now, let's go back to that runaway turbo on takeoff. It can happen before you leave the runway, but we'd just got the gear up when number 4 went crazy. My job was to keep her flying level. Co-pilot cut down that excessive manifold pressure with the throttle, not the turbo, down to 40 inches and fast, or you'll lose the engine. And here's why you use the throttle. What you're having is wastegate trouble. She slammed shut. Failure to exercise properly, or mechanical failure, or frozen condensation in the exhaust balance line. Whatever the cause, you get an excessive exhaust back pressure and an extreme pressure differential across the turbine buckets. And your turbo impeller's really running away, and that means excessive pressure is being delivered to the carburetor and manifold. This excessive pressure results in an excessively lean mixture which can damage the engine if allowed to continue long. So work fast. Dam off that pressure with the throttle. Throttle because your turbo control's probably gone anyway. That's all you can do. Save the engine. Keep her flying level and take her back in. I felt all right about the deal that day. Did my part of the job okay. We turned her over to the boys on the line for diagnosis and treatment. Cause of the trouble was failure of mechanical linkage. Ready to fly again in a couple of hours. You know, in some ways, maybe I have a kind of horse and buggy complex. I know all the advantages of the electronic control system, but I still sort of like working out the problems that go along with the hydraulic regulators. Take this pressure differential business, for instance. Anybody can learn to fiddle with the turbo controls during a climb to keep your manifold pressure from creeping up on you. But it's a good thing to know why it must be done. In the cockpit, it's power you're interested in, and power depends on manifold pressure. So after your takeoff, you reduce to 2,300 RPM and 38 inches manifold pressure. And the electronic system would hold her at about that pressure at all altitudes. But with the hydraulic controls, when you reduce to rated power for the climb, it means only that you've ordered your regulator to set the wastegate to maintain a constant gas back pressure in the exhaust stack. Let's say you have around 1,000 feet of altitude by the time you reduce power to 38 inches. Actually, you've set your wastegate to back up a pressure of about 31 inches here in the stack. At this altitude, free air pressure stands at around 29 inches. The difference between these two pressures, pressure differential, gives the turbo RPM needed to deliver, with the help of the engine blower, 38 inches manifold pressure. But you're climbing, and free air pressure is decreasing at the rate of about 1 barometric inch for every 1,000 feet of altitude. So what's the situation at 5,000 feet if you haven't changed your turbo setting since you reduced power? The regulators kept readjusting the wastegate position to maintain the same exhaust back pressure you had at around 1,031 inches. But atmospheric pressures dropped to around 25 inches. Pressure differential of 31 to 25 instead of 31 to 29, and impeller moving 2 or 3 times as fast as it was at 1,000 feet. It had to speed up some in this thinner air, but not that much. The result shows in the cockpit on your manifold pressure gauge. Pressure here in the manifold far above the value you want for climbing power. And that's the way you lose engines. But the remedy's simple. You order the regulator to open the wastegate a little. The exhaust back pressure decreases. The pressure differential is lowered and the impeller slows down, although, of course, it's still turning faster than it was at 1,000 feet. Your readjustment in the cockpit, of course, is made in terms of the result, manifold pressure, since you have no turbo tack, no instrument for pressure differentials. But the immediate result of turbo readjustment is always a change in the pressure differential across the turbine buckets. And on airplanes equipped with the oil regulators, turbos must be readjusted constantly on the climb. But it was that little tussle with carburetor icing that got me started on this stuff. We were on instruments, plenty of altitude, maximum long-range power setting. Weather, local showers. My instructor wanted me to figure things out for myself. When our manifold pressure began to fall off, I advanced throttles a little. Not too sharp. So my friend gave me a hint. Carburetor air temperature well within icing range. I finally caught on, called for intercoolers hot and carburetor filters on. But that wasn't the whole answer. My co-pilot let me sweat a little before doing what had to be done. Full turbo boost, at the same time, back on the throttles to keep manifold pressure down where we wanted it. That guy was the silent type, but he let me know how he felt. Then he froze on the carb air thermometer for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Well, here's the straight of it. The stuff in that elbow below the fuel jet is ice. Already, it's acting as a kind of secondary throttle. That's why your first warning may be a drop in manifold pressure. So defrosting's in order, but quick, before she's throttled off completely. We need heat, and drier air would help. So carburetor filters on. That's the first step. Reason? The filter's inside the wing where the air's heated up a little by the engines. Air in the wing's a little drier than outside air, too. But maybe that isn't enough. So, what about intercoolers hot? Okay. So you shut off that cold air from the outside. Just where will it get you? Suppose you're flying at an altitude where you don't need any turbo boost to maintain the manifold pressure you want. Engine blowers carrying the load alone. The turbo impeller's loafing, little or no compression taking place here. And as a result, intake air temperature is not raised noticeably. So the intercooler's hot trick isn't accomplishing a great deal. For remember, the intercooler cools only. It isn't a heater. In the hot position, it simply stops cooling. The carburetor's still in the jam, and so are you. The idea is to turn on the heat. And you have a nice fire laid right here, ready to touch off. Give her some turbo. Increase turbo RPM, turn on the heat. That gives you a higher rate of compression and raises intake air temperature. That hot intake air is being sent on to the carburetor without intercooling. However, in raising air pressure, we've also increased power, and that we don't want. So, we'll cut down that extra surge of power, manifold pressure, with the throttle. Get it down to the correct cruising value. But that, of course, cuts down pressure only. We're still getting heat in here to the ice. Result, spring thaw. And, of course, we've been a little slow about it. When you have icing conditions, use these tricks as precautions against icing. Don't wait until you're actually in trouble. And here's another trick. Under certain flight conditions, the wastegates may be nearly closed even though your turbo controls aren't all the way forward. So when you give her full boost, the increase in turbo RPM may not be great enough to give you the compression heat you need. But usually with this turbo condition, you'll be turning a fairly low engine RPM. In this case, we'll fall back on something we learned earlier, the fact that an increase in engine RPM also increases the rate of exhaust, which has the effect of speeding up your turbo. In other words, if you can't get the turbo compression heat you need with the turbo levers, you can fall back on prop pitch and get out of your jam that way. It's a good idea to consult your tech orders for the amount of turbo boost it's safe to use for this job at various altitudes. At high altitude, you have some other induction system problems to worry about. I don't think I ever put on an oxygen mask without thinking of carburetor filters. I suppose because the filter's a kind of a mask. But it's the kind that's hard to breathe through. A dust mask tied, in a way of speaking, over the airplane's nose. Silly, isn't it? But it's pretty obvious that intake air has a harder time getting through this filter than it does through the ram air intake. That's why, when you turn filters on, manifold pressure falls off about 1.5 inches. Filter has a throttling effect, and your reaction is to give her a little more turbo. That, of course, increases turbo speed. And the turbo has a top critical RPM beyond which it isn't guaranteed structurally. If you're climbing to high altitude, carburetor filters put an extra load on the turbo that will force it to exceed its critical speed long before it should, probably at around 20,000 feet. There's another neat way of doing that, too. Open up a hole in the high-pressure side of the system. Flat's good for that, or a pre-ignition backfire will do the trick. Too rapid throttle action before the engine's warm can cause such a backfire. Whatever the cause, you will probably keep increasing turbo boost as you climb to altitude to maintain the 38 inches you need for rated power. But now you're trying to supercharge the whole substratosphere. And again, the turbo will exceed its critical RPM long before reaching 30,000 feet. Just when will depend on the size of the hole that's opened in her. But suppose your induction system's tight. You get your filters turned off at the right time and reach 30,000 as you should without trouble. If you had an instrument for practically everything, you'd find an induction system situation something like this. Manifold pressure, 38 inches. Wastegate set to back up an exhaust pressure of around 25 inches. Outside barometric pressure, approximately 9 inches. Pressure differential, 25 to 9. Turbo supercharger has reached its top safe speed. Outside air at 9 inches pressure is sucked in by the turbo impeller and compressed to 26 inches. Outside in the weather, it's 48 below. Brass monkey situation. But turbo compression makes it cozy in here. Too cozy for comfort. Downright tropical. Intercooler puts it back in the temperate zone. Passing through the carburetor venturi cools it off some more. Not enough humidity at this altitude for icing trouble. Lost a little pressure on the way. It was 26 inches back there between the turbo and the intercooler. Engine blower finishes the job, building manifold pressure up to the value needed for rated power. If you're climbing above 30,000 feet, keep an eye on the altimeter. When you reach 31,000, reduce manifold pressure 1.5 inches below the rated power value. 36.5 inches at 31,000 and another 1.5 inches for every additional 1,000 feet. The reason is that rated power can't be maintained up here without forcing the turbo to exceed its maximum safe RPM because of the low outside air pressure. Some turbos have a higher critical altitude, but the principle's the same for all 17s equipped with oil regulators. Get the principle, and you'll never go far wrong in practice. Well, I guess that's the text of my sermon. My own luck changed for the better as soon as I could see what's likely to happen with a closed wastegate during the mag check. Knowing you can dam off the excessive pressure from a runaway turbo with the throttle will get you out of a lot of takeoff jams. With hydraulic regulators, decreasing barometric pressure on the climb will give you higher turbo speeds unless you readjust the position of the wastegate. When you run into carburetor icing conditions, remember the filter's inside the wing where the air is comparatively dry and warm. And that intercooler's hot won't do you any good unless your turbo's busy generating heat. Your carburetor filter's fine for dust and handy when you have carburetor icing, but it's a hard thing for an engine to breathe through and should not be used at high altitude. Damage done by pre-ignition backfire can result in turbo overspeeding at altitude. Fast throttle action before the engines are warm can do you the dirt. And reduce manifold pressure as you climb above your turbo's critical altitude. Airplanes, of course, aren't frozen. Improvements are being made constantly. Check your knowledge as often as possible against new directives and tech orders. In the end, it should all add up to a nice fat margin of safety. And to fatten that up, brother, even I'm willing to do a little bookwork.